In 1783, Reverend Johann Friedrich Zollner, an influential member of the Prussian government, wrote an essay addressing the intellectual community to answer the question, what is Enlightenment? One of those who penned a response was a German philosopher whose response would become one of the defining moments in this period of Western philosophy. The German philosopher was Immanuel Kant, and this is one of philosophy's greatest stories. The period of history that came to be known as the Enlightenment encapsulates many of the philosophers we have discussed throughout this series: Descartes, Leibniz, Hobbes, Locke, and so on. They are connected by their embracing of the new sciences and progress towards freedoms both in the mind, by which we mean thinking for oneself, and in the consent of people to govern themselves through representative democracy and the curtailing of the powers of absolute monarchs. However, is this enough to really define what Enlightenment is? While Descartes is often cited as the instigator of the Enlightenment, it cannot be said that that was his intent. As mentioned in the first episode of this series, Descartes' conception of radical doubt was not a challenge to religion, but, for him, a means to prove the fundamental truths of the Church without actually relying on them. So even non-religious people would have to accept them. So I could prove the existence of God using only my reason and my reason alone, without any interference from outside institutions. However, Descartes did not simply wake up one day and decide that this was the day he was going to commence the Enlightenment. History is not born in a single moment, but is made through progress, through the many people, institutions that eventually generate a spirit of the age by which we recognise a period of history. It is for this reason that in 1783, nearly 150 years after Descartes was writing, that the question what is enlightenment can perhaps be given an answer. Likewise, we have looked at the key Enlightenment figures in the previous episodes of this series, so now we can perhaps address this question of enlightenment ourselves. The Prussian government, led by Frederick II, or Frederick the Great, had taken large steps in reducing the state's reach and control of other people's lives, restricting the power of the church and fostering the development of the arts and the sciences, so people could freely express themselves and pursue their own interest and development freely. This was the society of the Enlightenment, where people were given the conditions to enlighten themselves without too much guidance about what that enlightenment should look like. Living in Prussia at the time and making his own contributions to Enlightenment philosophy was Immanuel Kant. Kant had published numerous works on many different branches of philosophy, most famously his Critique of Pure Reason, published in 1781 and a second edition in 1787. In 1783, he came across an essay written by Reverend Johann Friedrich Zollner, a member of the Prussian government, who had proposed the question, what is enlightenment, to the intellectual community for them to answer. Kant's reply came in December 1784 in the magazine Berlin Monthly. Although Kant was not the only one to reply to Zollner's question, it is his that has become the only one so significant to our conception of the Enlightenment that it will be worth going over in detail here. Kant was a philosopher who famously did not tolerate ambiguous positions on anything. Everything was either right or wrong, good or bad, true or false. Any in-between answers were simply not good enough for Kant. With this in mind, we can appreciate Kant's directness when he opens up his answer to the question what is enlightenment by immediately answering the question. Enlightenment is the human being's emergence from his self-incurred minority. The word minority here we can translate as immaturity. Kant is saying that the whole Enlightenment movement is based on the individual's enlightenment, that they bring themselves towards the light of reason by their own will. That this minority is self-incurred is a reference to the institutions that have held sway over public thought before and throughout the Enlightenment. Authoritarian governments and monarchs, and, more directly, the Church, who are a crutch that people lean on whenever they are presented with a problem. The Church provides answers, or does the hard work when an individual doesn't want to. They don't have to think for themselves. The Church does all of that for them. These institutions did not force people into their cooperation, Kant claims. It is self-incurred. People chose to rely on these institutions instead of finding the answers themselves. Just as people freely choose to self-incur their immaturity or minority, so in the Enlightenment, people are freely choosing to leave these institutions behind. Despite the difficulties that this entails. Sapere Aude, Kant declares, a Latin phrase that translates as dare to know, to learn, to gain knowledge, to enlighten oneself, naturally entails risk and courage. To break away from the institutions that provide knowledge to seek it for yourself is to risk opposing them. And since these institutions are the one which hold all the power in society, who rule countries and decide who to declare war upon, they have all the necessary power to crush anyone who dares to think contrary to their own positions. Many of the key figures of the Enlightenment had been persecuted or their work banned, mostly by the Church as promoting theories of mathematics and philosophy that would go against their teachings. But this attempted suppression was mostly in vain, as their works would find its way into the hands of others, who, even knowing what fate could await them, were prepared to dare to know for themselves and carry on the work of the Enlightenment. We have Galileo Galilei, who was placed under house arrest for his scientific theories, further cemented by the charge brought against his mother of witchcraft. Descartes' Meditations, who taught people to doubt everything to find those truths that could not be doubted, had his work declared heretical some 30 years after his death. Spinoza, who was accused of pantheism, the belief that God and nature are the same thing. And Giordano Bruno, who was burned at the stake for his idea that stars were in fact distant suns and could have planets like the Earth orbiting them, as well as his denial of the religious beliefs on the afterlife. Figures such as these became the cornerstone of Enlightenment thought, not only because their theories advanced thought in science, mathematics and philosophy, but also their daring to enlighten themselves through experimentation, observation, and knowing their results would make them enemies of powerful people. Living in Prussia, which had undergone reform to prevent institutions from meddling in affairs of people, Kant saw that freedom had been granted to its citizens, but because of laziness and cowardice, as he calls it, people are happy to be children cared for the rest of their lives, letting those that rule over them do the hard work. The Enlightenment, in one way, actually makes this worse. It produces books that tells people how to think. It gives them tools to do the hard work for them. People, for Kant, must have the freedom to enlighten themselves. It cannot be forced upon them. It is for this reason that Kant does not describe revolutions as being a product of the Enlightenment, here probably referring to the French and very recent American revolutions, saying that these revolutions throw off oppression, but simply replace old prejudices with new ones. What Kant is advocating for is the freedom to use reason to change a system progressively, rather than the revolutionary tactic of upending it completely. The freedom to use reason specifically refers to the public use of one's reason, which is worth going over here, and serves a key point in his own philosophy at large. Private reason is the reason that one uses in service to something. For example, if your job requires you to use your reason to perform tasks or bureaucratic functions, the use of this reason is restricted by the terms of your job. This is also what Kant would term as the theoretical use of reason. It is reason used in theory, not in service to ourselves, but to contribute to other purposes. Because of this, Kant says that one cannot prosecute someone for doing their job because they are merely administrating and do not have the freedom to decide what that job is or who it affects. The public use of reason is what relates to our freedom. It is what we make use of outside of any authority or employment. It is the freedom to use this reason publicly, which contributes to people's enlightenment. For example, we must all use our private reason to calculate and pay our taxes. But if we wish to criticize these taxes, then we can use our public reason to make our case against them. Again, if we do not have the freedom to speak publicly about the affairs of governments and institutions, then we cannot free ourselves from the grasp of our oppressors. For Kant, the age he lives in is an age of enlightenment, but it is not an enlightened age. An enlightened age would suggest that the project of enlightenment has been completed, which Kant does not believe to be the case. The work of the Prussian government in restricting the role that institutions play in people's lives and fostering a culture of art and science that people could freely follow was what Kant believed the role of government to be, to secure people's freedom. This is especially true in terms of religion, and a ruler who says it is his duty to not prescribe anything with regards to religious matters would be the most enlightened of all. Finally, Kant considers the point how people's civil freedoms enhance their freedom of spirit, but also hinder it. If people have the freedoms given to them, then that may become an encouragement for them to not use this freedom to enlighten themselves. Again, we may return to the daring to know of Sapere Aude. Without the daring and the risk that we face on our path to enlightenment, how will we ever be enlightened? Is it not this risk that allows us to bring ourselves out of our self-incurred minority? How could we mature if we do not in some way rebel against the authority of our guardians in some way? This seems to be the point that Kant is making, that we must recognize a duty to ourselves to uphold reason, rather than the blind duty to uphold the truth that an institution gives us. This is something that 20th century philosopher Michel Foucault highlights as the real definition of enlightenment in his own essay, What is Enlightenment? The learning to say no to authority. Kant's answer to the question of what is enlightenment provides a fairly succinct and straightforward definition of the times he is living in. Enlightenment is the human being's emergence from their self-incurred minority. The rules and beliefs that they have accepted as fact by institutions such as the Church are shed by those who wish to decide for themselves. Sapere Aude, daring to know. This search for enlightenment entails an element of danger. If one finds truths that are incompatible with authorities, then said authorities may punish them or restrict their freedom. For one who wishes to be enlightened, they will accept this risk. We should distinguish between the public and private use of reason. Private, theoretical reason is what we use in a job, for example, to perform tasks that are assigned to us. Public reason is what we use when we wish to take a position on whether something is good or bad, right or wrong, for example. Calculating and paying our taxes would be a private use of reason. But if we wanted to criticize an unfair tax, we would need the freedom to speak in a public capacity to make an argument against it. Kant's answer to the question of what is enlightenment has become one of the key texts referenced when defining this period of history. He would go on to influence Hegel, a German philosopher who put historical change and the spirit of history as one of the core elements of his philosophical system. The most prominent position in this essay that provokes disagreement is his disapproval of revolution. For Kant, revolution does nothing to enhance ordinary people's freedom. It merely replaces one tyranny with another, and the unthinking masses will simply attach themselves to the new rulers. However, one of the key events of the Enlightenment were undoubtedly the French and American revolutions, with the United States declaring its independence a mere 8 years before Kant's essay was published. These revolutions were fueled by the writings of prominent philosophers such as John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, but Kant still does not see the events as a path to enlightenment. Progress must instead be achieved through fixing the problems through the use of reason, and to establish other ways of thinking or doing things. Society must progress, and it does not do this, according to Kant, by upending it completely, as in the case of revolution. Another element of Kant's response that may draw controversy is that one cannot be prosecuted for their use of private reason. The idea that someone is innocent simply because they are following orders or just doing their job was heavily criticized by 20th century philosophers, particularly in the aftermath of World War II. Kant's conception of the Enlightenment captures not only the willingness for individuals to pursue truth and reason of their own accord, but also the risk involved in not relying on the support and guardianship of institutions and authorities, as well as the retribution they could unleash. Although the work of enlightenment was well underway, Kant acknowledges that the work is not yet complete. It is an age of enlightenment, rather than an enlightened age, and there is more work to be done. As individuals in this enlightening society, it is our individual and collective responsibility to safeguard the progress we have made and ensure our continued freedom to dare and to know.